A prophet who stopped time, challenged a tyrannical queen, and departed from this earth without ever knowing the cold embrace of the grave. What transpired in that fiery whirlwind that science cannot explain, and theology has revered for millennia? If you seek depth, revelation, and a narrative that will send shivers down your soul, you are in the right place. Stay until the very end, for what Elijah discovered in the fire will fundamentally alter how you perceive your own journey. Go ahead and click the channel's follow button now. This is the definitive documentary about the Prophet of Fire. The wind swept in from the east, blowing from the depths of the Arabian desert, traversing the Transjordan plateau until it struck the rugged hills of Gilead. This was no ordinary wind, it was the Hamsin. A gust laden with microscopic, reddish dust that infiltrated through window cracks, permeated garments of raw wool, and parched a man's throat before he could even finish uttering a sentence. For Elijah the Tishbite, this wind was an old acquaintance. Born in Tishbe, a village that King Ahab's official maps barely bothered to record, Elijah grew up in an environment where survival was not a right, but a daily achievement. Gilead was a land of contrasts, limestone hills that shone under the midday sun, deep valleys where sparse vegetation struggled to stay green, and a silence that was only interrupted by the bleating of sheep or the cry of a solitary eagle. It was there, in that geographical isolation, that Elijah's spirit was forged. While the young people of his age dreamed of the lights of Samaria or the trade routes that led to the luxury of Tyre, Elijah was busy listening to the silence. To the world, Elijah was a nobody. He did not boast a priestly genealogy, nor did he belong to the aristocracy of Israel. But he possessed something that the royal court had long lost, a sensitivity to the sacred. He sensed when the earth groaned. He felt, in the excessive heat of that east wind, that something was deeply wrong in the heart of the nation. Israel was not just suffering physically, the nation was undergoing a spiritual erosion that threatened to erase the memory of the God of their fathers. As Elijah walked among the stones of Gilead, a few kilometers away, the capital Samaria shone like a jewel of modern architecture. King Omri, Ahab's father, had been a master strategist. He bought the hill of Shemer and, upon it, built a city that rivaled the Phoenician metropolises in beauty. Samaria was the symbol of an Israel that wanted to be like other nations. There was no longer room there for the invisible God of the desert, the God who demanded exclusivity and justice. The new Israel wanted gods that could be seen, touched, and, above all, gods that promised prosperity without demanding morality. Ahab, Omri's heir, took this vision to the extreme. He was not necessarily an evil man in his administrative essence, but he was a dangerously adaptable man. His greatest political achievement was his marriage to Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Jezebel was not just a queen consort, she was a force of nature, a woman of absolute conviction and religious fanaticism. She did not accept the God of Israel as the Lord of the land. For her, the true Lord of fertility, rain, and thunder was Baal. Upon entering Samaria, Jezebel brought with her a legion of 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. She financed these religious schools with the tax money of the people of Israel. Sumptuous temples were erected. Ivory, brought from distant lands, decorated the palaces where discussions were held on how to eradicate the worship of Yahweh. Jezebel initiated a silent inquisition, prophets of the Lord were hunted and killed in caves, ancient altars were torn down, and the memory of Sinai was replaced by the sensual and bloody rituals of Phoenician cults. The people were confused. After all, if harvests depended on rain, and Baal was the Lord of the clouds, why not offer a sacrifice to him? The theology of convenience was winning. Israel was limping. One foot tried to maintain the tradition of Moses, while the other plunged into the cult of Jezebel. It was in this scenario of opulence and spiritual betrayal that Elijah received his first divine directive. There was no grand choir of angels or a liturgical vision in the temple. It was something direct, like the wind that shaped him. Elijah felt the weight of God's word burning in his bones. He looked at the clear, blue skies of Israel and received the command to confront the most powerful man on earth. Elijah did not prepare with silk garments. He wore his camel hair cloak, a leather belt, and nothing more. His appearance was the antithesis of Samaria's luxury. He crossed the Jordan, climbed the hills of Ephraim, and entered through the gates of the capital. The royal guards, accustomed to Phoenician diplomats and Egyptian merchants, must have looked with disdain at that rustic man, with long hair and eyes that seemed to carry burning embers. Without requesting an audience, without following diplomatic protocols, Elijah invaded Ahab's presence. The king, seated on his throne surrounded by advisors and probably with Jezebel by his side, saw a figure from the desert point a finger in his direction. Elijah's phrase was short, but charged with an authority that made the palace marble seem fragile. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. There was a deadly silence in the room. To stop the rain in an agrarian economy was to declare the end of the nation. But Elijah was not making a weather prediction, he was attacking the heart of Jezebel's divinity. If Baal was the god of rain, Elijah was proving that Baal did not hold the keys to heaven. The one who held control over the clouds was not a golden statue in Samaria, but the God of Israel, whose name Ahab was trying to erase. Before the guards could react, before Jezebel could utter a curse, Elijah disappeared. He did not stay to argue. He did not stay to see the reaction. He simply left the city, returning to the place where God would hide him. The next command was clear: depart from here, turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith. Cherith was a wadi, a dry gorge that only received water during the rainy seasons. Humanly speaking, it was the worst place to hide from a drought. But God was teaching Elijah the principle of absolute providence. Elijah would be cut off from the world. He would have no news, no friends, no access to markets. He would have only God's promise. And here enters one of the most intriguing details of Elijah's journey: the ravens. God commanded the ravens to bring bread and meat to the prophet, morning and evening. For the Israelites, the raven was an unclean animal, a scavenger that fed on carrion. To see a prophet being fed by unclean animals was a paradigm shift. God was saying to Elijah, I use what I want to sustain those I love. Imagine the scene: Elijah sitting at the bottom of that gorge, the silence broken only by the flapping of black wings. The ravens brought provisions that Elijah had no idea where they came from, perhaps from Ahab's own royal table, stolen by divine command. While the kingdom of Israel began to feel the first signs of hunger, while the earth began to crack and the cattle to groan, Elijah was sustained by the impossible. But Elijah's test would not stop there. The brook Cherith began to dry up. Day after day, the trickle of water became narrower, until only mud remained, and then, only hot stones. Elijah looked at the disappearing water and must have wondered, God, I prophesied the drought and now my own source has dried up. Often, God lets our source dry up to force us to move to the next level of our mission. Cherith was the school of isolation, the next step would be the school of sacrifice in enemy territory. The brook Cherith finally fell silent. Where before ran the comforting sound of water hitting the stones, now there was only the crackle of parched earth under Israel's relentless sun. Elijah looked at the empty streambed and understood the message: the cycle of isolation had ended. But God's next instruction seemed like a death sentence or, at the very least, a geographical paradox. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain you. Sidon, the heart of Phoenicia. Jezebel's homeland. The headquarters of Baal worship. God was sending his prophet into the eye of the hurricane. While Ahab sent armies and diplomats to all neighboring nations to capture Elijah, making him the most wanted man in the Middle East, God sent him to hide right under Jezebel's father's nose. It was a strategy of hiding in plain sight. Furthermore, there was a deep spiritual irony. If Baal was the god of fertility and provision, Elijah would prove that, even in the land of Baal, the one who sustained life was Yahweh. Elijah's walk to Zarephath was a journey of almost 150 kilometers through an apocalyptic landscape. The drought he had prophesied was now at its peak. Along the roads, he saw carcasses of animals that even the vultures no longer wanted, for there was no meat, only hide and bone. The dust rose with each step, entering his lungs and making breathing a conscious effort. Elijah passed through villages where the children's crying was hoarse from lack of water. He saw the human cost of his own prophecy, and this forged in him a temperament that few prophets possessed, the ability to carry the weight of divine judgment without losing obedience. Upon arriving at the gates of Zarephath, the scene Elijah found was not that of a rich and hospitable widow prepared to receive him. He saw a ragged woman, her face hollowed by malnutrition, gathering sticks on the ground. She was the living image of silent despair. Elijah, testing divine providence and the woman's willingness, makes a simple request that, in that context, was a request for gold: "Bring me, please, a little water in a vessel for me to drink." The woman, with a dignity that survived misery, turned to fetch the water. But as she walked away, Elijah added another request, even more audacious: "Bring me also a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped, her shoulders slumped, and she turned back to Elijah, her eyes filled with a pain that went beyond hunger. "As the Lord your God lives," she said, "I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This was the last meal. The end of the line. The final act of a tragedy. Elijah was asking for the impossible. He was asking for the last morsel of hope. But God was not testing the woman's generosity, he was testing her faith. And Elijah, as God's messenger, was the instrument of that test. Elijah's response was not one of pity, but of divine authority: "Do not fear, go and do as you have said. But first make me a small cake from it and bring it to me, and afterward make for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, nor the jug of oil become empty, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The woman, whose name is not recorded, made a choice that day that echoed through eternity. She could have clung to her last meal, to her logic, to her despair. But she chose to obey. She chose to trust the word of a stranger, a prophet of a foreign god, over the undeniable reality of her empty pantry. She went and did according to Elijah's word. And the miracle began. For many days, the jar of flour did not run out, nor did the jug of oil become empty. The woman, her son, and Elijah ate. It was a daily miracle, a constant reminder that God's provision is not limited by human logic or the scarcity of resources. It was a lesson in dependence, a testament to the power of faith in the face of the impossible. But the story of Zarephath was not just about provision. It was also about resurrection. One day, the widow's son fell ill. His illness worsened, and he died. The woman, in her grief, confronted Elijah: "What have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" This was a common belief in ancient times: illness and death were often seen as divine punishment for sin. The woman, in her pain, believed that Elijah's presence had somehow brought God's judgment upon her. But Elijah knew that God's purpose was not to punish, but to reveal his power. Elijah took the dead child from her arms, carried him up to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord: "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even upon this widow with whom I am staying, by killing her son?" Elijah was not just praying, he was wrestling with God. He stretched himself out on the child 3 times, crying out to the Lord: "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's voice, the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper room into the house, and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." The woman's response was a declaration of faith: "Now by this I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Zarephath was not just a place of provision, it was a place of revelation. It was where a pagan woman, in the heart of Baal's territory, discovered the true God of Israel. After these events, God's command came again: Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. The time of hiding was over. The time of confrontation had returned. Elijah was ready. Elijah walked for many days, until he found Ahab. The king, seeing Elijah, immediately accused him, "Is it you, troubler of Israel?" Elijah, with unwavering courage, responded, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." Mount Carmel. A place of natural beauty, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It was chosen by Elijah as the stage for the greatest spiritual showdown in Israel's history. It was there that the God of Israel would face the gods of Jezebel. The scene was set, Elijah, alone, against 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, and a vast crowd of confused Israelites. Elijah's challenge was simple: how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. The people remained silent. Elijah then proposed a test: 2 altars, 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal would choose one, cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Elijah would do the same. "Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." All the people answered and said, "It is well spoken." The prophets of Baal went first. From morning until noon, they cried out to Baal, "O Baal, hear us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. They leaped about the altar that they had made. Elijah mocked them, "Cry aloud, for he is a god, either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, till the blood gushed out on them. From noon until the time of the evening sacrifice, they raved, but there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. He took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." Then with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood, and said, "Fill 4 water pots with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood." Then he said, "Do it a second time," and they did it a second time, and he said, "Do it a third time," and they did it a third time. So the water ran all around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. And it came to pass, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Elijah then commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. The spiritual battle was won. The fire of God had consumed the sacrifice and revealed his power. After this, Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." Ahab went up to eat and drink. But Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, then he bowed down on the ground, and put his face between his knees, and said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked, and said, "There is nothing." 7 times Elijah sent him. And it came to pass the 7th time, that he said, "There is a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea." So Elijah said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down before the rain stops you." Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. So Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. The drought was over. God had answered by fire and by rain. But the victory on Carmel was not the end of Elijah's trials. When Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had executed all the prophets with the sword, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." Elijah, who had just faced 850 prophets and the king, now fled from a single woman. He arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die, and said, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This was the prophet at his lowest point. Exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone. He had just witnessed the greatest display of God's power, yet he was ready to give up. But God did not abandon him. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, an angel touched him, and said to him, "Arise and eat." Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on hot coals, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank, and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time, and touched him, and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. At Horeb, Elijah entered a cave and stayed there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice. So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him, and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah repeated his complaint. But God was not just listening, he was revealing himself in a new way. Not in the spectacular, but in the subtle. Not in the loud, but in the quiet. God was teaching Elijah that his power was not limited to fire and wind, but was also present in the gentle whisper. God then gave Elijah new instructions: "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." Elijah's mission was not over, but it was changing. He was no longer alone. He was to anoint his successor. This was a crucial moment in his journey, a transition from solitary prophet to mentor. So Elijah departed from there, and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. Elisha immediately left the oxen and ran after Elijah, and said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" Elisha returned from following him, and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh with the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah, and became his servant. This was Elisha's farewell to his old life, a complete commitment to his new calling. Years passed. Elisha served Elijah faithfully, learning from him, observing his miracles, and absorbing his wisdom. He was more than a servant, he was a disciple, a son in the Spirit. But the time for Elijah's departure was approaching, And it came to pass, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" And he said, "Yes, I know, keep silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho came to Elisha and said, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" So he answered, "Yes, I know, keep silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, and it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And so it was, when they had crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask, what may I do for you, before I am taken away from you?" Elisha said, "Please, let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." He knew that to face what lay ahead, the ordinary measure of power would not be enough. He needed everything Elijah had and more, whatever was necessary for the new stage. Elijah answered with a gravity that made Elisha shiver, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if not, it shall not be so." The miracle of succession would depend on Elisha's ability to keep his eyes open to the invisible. He needed to be able to see beyond the curtain of physical reality. Vision would be the criterion for receiving the inheritance. If Elisha blinked, if he allowed himself to be distracted by fear or by the wind, he would lose the legacy. They continued walking and talking. The text does not record what they spoke about, but imagine the last instructions of a master who sees heaven opening. And it was there, between one step and another, that the world as they knew it simply ceased to exist. They walked across the arid plain east of the Jordan. The scenery was of a desolate beauty, the setting sun gilded the sands and the mountains of Moab in the distance. Elijah and Elisha continued their conversation, a dialogue that spanned years of companionship, miracles, and shared silences. Elisha was on high alert, every fiber of his being was focused on the figure of his master. He remembered the condition, "If you see me when I am taken." His eyes did not blink, ignoring the sweat and dust. Suddenly, the air, which had been stagnant, began to swirl. It was not the east wind of Gilead, nor the storm of Carmel. It was something new, an energy that seemed to originate from within a vacuum in space itself. The sky did not just darken, it opened into a rift of unbearable light. And then, it happened. The Hebrew text uses language that desperately tries to describe the indescribable, Merkavah. A chariot of fire and horses of fire. Modern imagination often tries to project technologies or spacecraft here, but for the ancients, the chariot and horse were the ultimate symbols of power, speed, and military dominance. What Elisha saw was not a vehicle of flaming metal, but a manifestation of God's glory, the Shekinah, taking a form that the human mind could process. The chariot and horses of fire did not come to fetch the two, they came to separate them. It was a maneuver of divine precision. The celestial fire passed between the master and the disciple like a blade of light, creating an impassable boundary between time and eternity. In an instant, Elijah was enveloped by a whirlwind, a vortex of wind and fire that tore him from the dusty ground of the desert. Elisha saw. He did not just see the physical phenomenon, he saw the spiritual reality behind it. He let out a cry that echoed through the hills of Moab, a cry of pain, recognition, and transfer, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." By calling Elijah, "Father," Elisha was formally accepting spiritual sonship. By calling him, chariots and cavalry of Israel, Elisha was recognizing that the true defense of the nation lay not in Ahab's armies, but in the presence of a single man faithful to God. Elijah alone was more powerful than all the kingdom's infantry divisions. Elijah ascended. No body was left behind. There was no tomb to be venerated. Elijah disappeared into the light, becoming the first man since Enoch to cross the boundary of death without being overcome by it. He was translated, transformed, taken to a dimension where fire does not consume, but sustains. But something was left behind. As Elijah ascended, his hairy mantle, that same mantle that had touched Elisha in the plowing field, that same mantle that had divided the Jordan minutes before, began to fall. It floated through the air, slowly swirling in the wake of the whirlwind, until it gently landed in the dust at Elisha's feet. The mantle was now just a piece of animal skin fabric. But it carried the double portion. It was tangible proof that Elisha's prayer had been answered. Elijah was gone, but his authority remained on earth. Elisha was alone. The silence that followed the whirlwind was deafening. He looked up, but the sky was blue and mute again. Elisha's first reaction was a gesture of deep mourning. He took his own garments and tore them into two pieces. He was symbolizing that the old Elisha, Elijah's servant, had died at that moment. He bent down and picked up Elijah's mantle. As he held the rough fabric, he knew that his life would never be the same. He would not return to Abel-Meholah, he would not return to the farms. He walked back to the bank of the Jordan. 50 prophets watched from afar, from the other side of the river. They saw the whirlwind, they saw the light, but they did not know what had happened to Elijah's authority. They waited to see if the disciple would have the same strength as the master. Elisha stood before the waters of the Jordan. He was now in the same place where, minutes before, Elijah had performed the miracle. He rolled up Elijah's mantle, exactly as the master had done, and struck the waters. But he did not rely solely on the object. He issued a challenge to the heavens: "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Yes, where is he? It was not a question of doubt, but an invocation of power. The result was immediate: the river divided on both sides. Elisha crossed on dry ground. When they saw this, the sons of the prophets prostrated themselves before him and said, "The spirit of Elijah rests upon Elisha." The succession was complete. The rapture was not an end, but an expansion. Elijah had been taken to the fire, but had left the fire burning in another heart. When Elisha crossed the Jordan back and saw the sons of the prophets prostrating themselves, he understood that Elijah's solitude was now his. The whirlwind had taken the man, but left the weight. The prophets of Jericho, still trapped in purely material logic, could not accept that Elijah simply no longer existed in the physical dimension. They insisted on sending 50 strong men to search the mountains and valleys for 3 days, thinking that perhaps the Spirit of the Lord had released him on some mountain. Elisha tried to stop them, knowing the search was futile, but eventually yielded to their blind insistence. After 3 days, the men returned exhausted and empty-handed. Elijah was not in any cave, on any peak, in any valley. He had transcended geography. This episode serves to show us that Elijah's rapture was not a disappearance, but a divine translocation. He did not die, he was promoted to a reality where death has no jurisdiction. Elijah's departure left an open wound in Israel's hope. Since he did not know the grave, he became the living symbol that God's story with his people was not yet finished. Centuries later, the last of the Old Testament prophets, Malachi, would conclude the biblical canon with an electrifying promise: "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." This promise permanently shaped Jewish culture. To this day, during the celebration of the Jewish Passover, Pesach, an empty chair and an untouched cup of wine are left at the table, Elijah's cup. At the end of the meal, the door is opened so that the prophet can enter. They wait for the man who ascended in fire, for his return is the sign that the Messiah is close behind. Elijah became the eternal forerunner, the herald of final redemption. Elijah's shadow runs through the entire New Testament. When John the Baptist appeared in the desert, wearing the same camel hair clothes and preaching repentance on the banks of the same Jordan River, the people had no doubt. They asked him directly if he was Elijah. Jesus would later confirm that John had come in the spirit and power of Elijah. But the most impactful moment happens on the Mount of Transfiguration. There, centuries after the whirlwind, Elijah makes a new earthly appearance. He appears beside Moses, conversing with Jesus about his departure in Jerusalem. It is a meeting of dimensions. Moses represents the law and those who died, Elijah represents the prophets and those who were raptured. There, at the top of another mountain, the circle closes. The prophet who asked to die under a broom tree in the desert now shines beside the King of Glory, proving that the suffering in Zarephath and the solitude in Horeb were worth it. The story of Elijah and the fiery horses is not just an account of an ancient wonder or a biblical special effect. It is an affirmation that human life has a destiny that exceeds the limits of biology. Elijah's journey, from the dry wind of Gilead to the celestial fire, teaches us that character is forged in obedience, even when the brook dries up and the world seems to be crumbling. Elijah shows us that God's fire can come to consume our sacrifice, as on Carmel, to purify us in the desert, or to take us home. He was the man who did not bow before earthly kings, and for that, he received a chariot from the King of Kings. His legacy is the cloak he left for Elisha and for all those who have the courage to look to heaven and ask for the double portion of courage to fight injustice and spiritual forgetfulness. The whirlwind has passed, but the fire continues to burn. Elijah's story ends in the clouds, but the impact of his life continues here on earth, in every heart that decides not to limp between two thoughts. Elijah's mantle is still falling on those who would dare to ask, "Where is the God of Elijah?" If you've made it this far, you haven't just watched a story, you've witnessed proof that heaven is real and that faithfulness to God has a reward that fire cannot destroy. Thank you for following this special documentary to the very end. We dedicated hours to research and scripting to deliver this content to you. If this film expanded your biblical understanding and touched your soul, don't leave without leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be renewed by the fire of God. And now, we want to hear from you. What other biblical character do you want to see here in documentary format? Comment below and we'll see you on the next journey for truth.